In a remote section of Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, a peaceful and serene area in the center of the cemetery that gets few visitors and hasn't had many new burials in the past few decades, is the final resting place of Florence Anna Flo Ann Ross, who died on November 5th, 1933 in Fresno, California at the age of 19. The most notable part of Flo Ann's grave marker is the detailed image of a small plane. Looking closer, the plane on Flo Ann's grave marker has a broken wing and a bent and broken propeller. Not the typical imagery for a grave marker, especially not for a teenage girl. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, when Flo Ann was a student at Belmont High School in Los Angeles, Amelia Earhart was capturing the world's attention as a pioneering, record-setting aviator and the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. At the same time, Flo Ann Ross was learning to fly in California. It's not known what inspired Flo Ann to take up flying, but it's logical to assume that Amelia Earhart was an inspiration and a role model for the teenage aviator. Flo Ann Ross was born in 1914 in East Texas, the first child of Henry Grady Ross and Maybelle Betty Bush Ross. Henry Ross worked as a railroad brakeman and conductor, and the family moved often because of Henry's job. Shortly after Flo Ann's birth, the family moved to Oklahoma, to a small town and railroad transportation center about 35 miles south of Tulsa, where Flo Ann's younger sister Evelyn was born in 1918. The Ross family then moved to Denver, Colorado, where their third child, Harold, was born in 1921. In the early 1920s, Flo Ann's parents divorced. Her father moved to Chicago, and in 1925, Betty Ross brought her two young daughters, Flo Ann, 11, and Evelyn, 7, to Southern California. Their younger brother, 4-year-old Harold, was sent to live with his paternal grandparents, John and Roxy Ross, in Rusk, Texas. On August 20th, 1930, Flo Ann's mother, Betty, married brickyard foreman Riney Nitz, the Missouri-born son of German immigrants, and the family lived at 3916 Ardmore Avenue in Southgate, a few miles southwest of Los Angeles. After a brief marriage, Betty and Riney divorced, and Betty, Flo Ann, and Evelyn moved into this apartment building at 1226 North Hoover Street, between Santa Monica Boulevard and Fountain Avenue, about a block west of Sunset Boulevard. After graduating from Belmont High School, Flo Ann returned to Southgate, where she worked at a beauty parlor. In mid-1933, she moved back to Los Angeles, into the apartment on North Hoover with her mother and sister, and she worked as a waitress. Flo Ann's younger sister Evelyn died on February 28, 2004, at the age of 85 in Austin, Texas. According to Evelyn's obituary in the Austin American-Statesman newspaper, from the mid-1920s until the late 1940s, Evelyn enjoyed LA's golden age. And it's likely that Evelyn's older sister enjoyed the same entertainment and fun in Los Angeles. According to her obituary, Evelyn danced to the music of the big bands, watched the movie stars and marathon dances at the beach, and graduated from Belmont High in 1936. She made lifelong friends there, but was grieved by the loss of her sister, an early aviatrix who died at 19 in a plane crash. For several years, Flo Ann had been interested in flying and had been taking flying lessons from Darius Johnson of Los Angeles, who owned a 3-year-old open cockpit two-seat biplane, a Travel Air 2000, which was often used as a training plane for new pilots. At the time of her crash, Flo Ann had been taking flying lessons for more than 2 years. She had a student pilot's license and 22 hours of solo flying experience. On weekends, Johnson and Flo Ann would take Johnson's Travel Air 2000 about 225 miles north of Los Angeles, where they would practice flying at an abandoned airfield about 7 miles north of Fresno. On Sunday, November 5th, 1933, Johnson and Flo Ann first flew to the Chandler Airfield in Fresno, which had opened 4 years earlier, then made the short flight to the abandoned airfield north of the city. In Fresno, Flo Ann and Johnson were joined by another of Johnson's flying students, Carl Lowe of Fresno, and Lowe's friend, Maxine Welch. After Lowe made a few practice flights, Johnson took Flo Ann up for a few short instructional flights. Flo Ann then asked if she could take the plane up for a solo flight. Johnson agreed, but he warned her that the air was rough at 800 to 1,000 feet. Flo Ann took off smoothly in the Travel Air 2000 and climbed to an altitude of about 800 feet. She was heading west and started a steep bank turn to the south to prepare for a landing when a strong gust of wind from the north hit the tiny plane, spinning it around. Flo Ann lost control and the plane spun toward the ground in a power dive. As Johnson, Lowe, and Welch watched from the ground, the plane continued to spin as Flo Ann struggled to regain control. The plane hit the ground and Flo Ann's head slammed into the instrument panel. Investigators believe that Flo Ann fought to pull the plane out of its fatal dive until the moment of impact. Flo Ann suffered a fractured skull, a broken arm, two broken legs, a crushed chest, and other injuries. She was taken to General Hospital in Fresno. After being told of the crash, Flo Ann's mother and sister immediately flew up from Los Angeles to the hospital in Fresno. Flo Ann died about 6 hours after the crash without regaining consciousness. When Flo Ann Ross died, it was front page news all over the state of California and across the country. In 1933, the idea of a female pilot was still a novelty. It was only 5 years after Amelia Earhart's solo flight across the Atlantic, and only 13 years after women in the United States had won the right to vote. More than one newspaper described Flo Ann Ross as the flying waitress. Flo Ann's body was brought back to Los Angeles, and Christian Science funeral services were held at the Little Church of the Flowers at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. Flo Ann was buried in the cemetery's Vesperland section, close to the center of the cemetery property. Flo Ann's grave is in lot 639, space 2, near the crest of a hill on the south side of the Vesperland section, overlooking Babyland. In the 1940s, Flo Ann's mother Betty and her sister Evelyn moved back to Texas, living first in Corpus Christi, then Amarillo, where they operated the Betsy Ross gift shop. If not for a random gust of wind over an abandoned airfield in Fresno in 1933, what might have happened to Flo Ann Ross? Would she have continued her aviation training? Would she have followed in the wake of Amelia Earhart as an early aviation pioneer and flown for distance, speed, and endurance records? That's always the most painful question about someone with so much potential who dies at such a young age. What might have been? Flo Ann would have been 27 years old when the United States entered World War II, and she likely would have continued her interest in flying and aviation. Would she have been part of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs? It seems likely that Flo Ann would have considered joining the WASPs. In addition to her obvious sense of daring and adventure, she would have had more than a decade of flying experience. But would she have joined the military? That also seems likely. Flo Ann's mother, Betty, enlisted and served in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps during World War II when she was in her late 40s, and she's buried in Texas beneath a military grave marker. And perhaps as a tribute to her daughter, Betty Ross enlisted as an aviation cadet. Had she lived, would Flo Ann Ross have been America's first female war hero? Would her name be remembered today alongside Amelia Earhart? Or Bessie Coleman, the first Black American and first Native American to have an international pilot's license? Or Harriet Quimby, the first American woman to have a pilot's license and the first woman to fly across the English Channel? Or Betty Scott, an early pilot, stunt pilot, and test pilot, and one of the first women to drive an automobile across the country? Or Margaret Phelan Taylor, one of the WASPs who received the Congressional Medal of Honor for her service during World War II as pioneering, groundbreaking female aviators? Unfortunately, those questions can never be answered for Flo Ann Ross. Because of an unexpected wind over an abandoned airport in Fresno, her life was cut short, and her potential achievements will never be known. After Flo Ann's death, her mother and sister moved back to Texas, where they died and are buried. Flo Ann never married, had no children, and no other family in California. Most of the graves around Flo Ann are for people who died in the early 1930s. For them, their children and grandchildren are likely no longer around to visit their graves. And for Flo Ann Ross, there are no family or friends to visit, and there haven't been for more than 80 years. So the next time you visit Forest Lawn in Glendale, stop by the Vesperland section, lot 639, space 2, and say hello to the brave and tragic young aviator, Flo Ann Ross.